Hello and welcome back. Today we start Chapter 2, The Chemistry of Life. This chapter will take us into the realm of chemistry. The general principles of chemistry that we will learn about here are important in biology, as we will see over the course of this semester. This chapter will be split into 2 lectures, but here are the key concepts that we will go over during this chapter. We will learn about the atomic structure of the atom. We'll learn about how atoms interact with the 4 molecules. We'll also learn the importance of organic molecules such as carbohydrates and lipids, and finally, how biochemically changes involve energy. First off, all matter, both living and non-living, is composed of atoms. We will look at the structure of the atom on the next slide. Protons and neutrons are found in the center of the atom, which is also referred to as the nucleus. Protons have a positive charge, and neutrons have a neutral charge. Like charges repel one another, while opposite charges attract one another. Most atoms are neutral in charge because the amount of electrons equal the amount of protons. An element is a pure substance that contains only one type of atom. Living organisms are mostly composed of 6 elements: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. These are often collectively referred to as the sponge elements, with each letter denoting a different element. There are other elements found in living organisms, but these are the most common. The number of protons identify the element, which give the element its atomic number. Hydrogen's atomic number here, as an example, is 1. In order for the element to be neutral, protons must equal electrons. The mass number is the number of protons and neutrons. Protons and neutrons both contribute to the element's weight. The common structure of an atom you see on this slide is referred to as the Bohr model. Most of the area an atom inhabits is empty space. The electrons travel around the nucleus in orbits, are oftentimes referred to as electron shells. Electrons are important to atoms because electrons will determine if a chemical bond will form between atoms. Depending on the element, an atom can have 1 or more electron shells. These shells can only hold a certain number of electrons. The first shell can only hold 2 electrons, while the second shell can only hold 8. The third shell can hold a maximum of 18 electrons. The concept of electrons in the atom's shells lead us to our next topic, the octet rule. For elements with atomic numbers 6 through 20, these atoms will either share, lose, or gain electrons in order to maintain 8 electrons in its outermost shell. When atoms do this with their electrons, either gain, lose, or share, they form stable associations called molecules. Here's our first progress check for our chapter. Please do your best to answer these questions and continue on with the lecture. Now that we've learned about electrons, we will talk about chemical bonds. Chemical bond is an attractive force that links atoms together to form molecules. There are different types of chemical bonds, but we will be focusing on 3 of them. This is table 2.1 from the book. It gives a brief overview of the chemical bonds. This is a good table to reference back to later for review as you study. We will focus on ionic bonds, covalent bonds, and hydrogen bonds. First type of bond we will focus on is the ionic bond. An ionic bond is when the electronegativities differ between two atoms. Electronegativities are determined by the charges in the nucleus and the size of the atom. A complete transfer of electrons may occur if the electronegativity is different enough between two atoms. With the transfer of atoms, this will make the two atoms stable because their outer shells are now full. The result is two ions. An ion is an electrically charged particle that forms when an atom gains or loses electrons. For example, atom on the left has 1 electron in its outer shell, while the atom on the right has 7. In order for the atom on the right to achieve 8 electrons, it will take the left atom's 1 electron. Now the right atom has 8 electrons in its outermost shells, becoming stable. Don't feel sorry for the atom on the left, however. Now by removing that 1 electron, its outer shell has 2 electrons. Remember from a few slides back we said the first shell only needs 2 electrons to be full? Well, now it is. Both atoms have full outer shells. Here's another example with sodium and chlorine. Sodium has 1 shell in its outer ring, while chlorine has 7 electrons in its outer ring. Chlorine has a greater electronegativity than sodium, so it'll take sodium's lonely electron. This will give both atoms 8 electrons in its outer shells. Since chlorine gained an extra electron, it will become more negative to the electron's negative charge, while sodium will become more positive since it lost the electron in its negative charge. This will make the two atoms attracted to one another due to their different charges. So a quick aside. I know many of you might be wondering why we are talking about chemistry so much in a biology course. This is because biology has a lot of its foundation based in chemistry. If nothing else, chemistry has some very good puns in it, such as this cat, who I affectionately call ChemCat. He says he's lost an electron. In fact, he's pretty positive about it. Please don't start all laughing at once. Anyways, this is to reinforce that when an atom loses an electron, it becomes more positive due to the loss of that negative charge. Also, I always wonder how they got those glasses and bow tie on that cat. If anyone can figure that out, please let me know. Back to ionic bonds. There are 2 types of ions, cations and anions. Cations have a positive charge, while anions have a negative charge. Ionic attractions are mainly referred to as ionic bonds and result with the electrical attraction between 2 ions with separate charges. Probably have heard of the saying opposites attract? Well, that's true with ions. Negative ions are attracted to positive ions. The resulting molecule is now called an ionic compound. Salt is an example of an ionic molecule. Ionic attractions are weak compared to other types of bonds. This is one reason that salt dissolves in water. We'll talk more about that when we look at hydrogen bonds in a little bit. Next type of bond that we will explore are what are called covalent bonds. Covalent bonds are formed when atoms share electrons. Note the difference here with ionic bonds, where in that scenario, electrons are taken. Within covalent bonds, the atom gets stability by having full outer shells, where each atom contributes 1 electron to the pair. In the top right is an example of covalent bonding. Between the 2 atoms that you see here, you can see that they're sharing electrons. If you count the electrons, you'll see that each atom now has 8 and is considered stable. Here's an example of 2 hydrogen atoms sharing electrons. Each hydrogen atom has 1 lonely electron. If they share them between the 2 of them, the outer ring for both hydrogen atoms now have 2, or again considered stable. Next, we'll talk about covalent bonding in carbon. Carbon has 4 electrons in its outer shell. It needs 4 more to have a total of 8 to make it stable. Carbon can form 4 covalent bonds with 4 other atoms. An example would be on the lower right, with carbon forming 4 bonds with hydrogen atoms in order to achieve stability. Here's another example of carbon forming bonds with 4 other hydrogen atoms to form methane. Table 2.2 is a quick resource of the covalent capacities of some biological important elements. As you can see here, we have our sponge elements from earlier. Oxygen can only form 2 covalent bonds with other atoms. Nitrogen can form 3 covalent bonds. Carbon can form up to 4, and phosphorus can form up to 5. The properties of molecules are influenced by the covalency of the bonds they have. Bonds give molecules a particular orientation, where the length and angle between the elements are always the same. For example, methane, which has 1 carbon atom covalently bonded to 4 hydrogen atoms, always forms tetrahedron. The angle and length between hydrogen and carbon is always the same for all methane molecules. Out of all the types of molecular bonds we will look at in this lecture, covalent bonds are relatively strong. It takes a lot of energy to break them. In addition, there are 3 types of covalent bonds. Atoms sharing electrons may have a single covalent bond, where they share only 1 pair of electrons, a double covalent bond, where they share 2 pairs of electrons, sometimes even triple bonds, where they share 3 pairs of electrons. When it comes to sharing electrons within covalent bonds, there are 2 different scenarios that can play out. The atoms may share the electrons equally, or not. The nucleus of one element may have a greater electronegativity than the other atom. This is when a nucleus exerts an attractive force on the electrons. This depends on the number of protons and the distance between a nucleus and the electrons. As we said earlier, protons are positive and attract negative electrons. One atom in a covalent bond has more protons than the other atom, will more likely attract the electrons within that covalent bond. Table 2.3 from our book has some electronegativities of some elements. The greater the electronegativity, the more likely that atom will attract the electrons more. So you may be wondering, where are we going with all of this? Atoms that share electrons equally between themselves have similar electronegativities and are called nonpolar covalent bonds. Notice the picture on the left up here. These are 2 atoms sharing electrons. The light blue cloud surrounding the 2 dots or where the electrons travel. No single atom has more attractive force to the electrons than the other. So again, this is considered a non-polar covalent bond. A polar covalent bond is when electrons tend to be near the most attractive atom. This occurs when the atoms have different electronegativities. Notice the picture on the top right. The atom on the right in this pair has a bigger cloud, and you can see it is more negative. That is because it does not share electrons well with the other atom on the left. Since the atom on the left does not have the electrons as much as the one on the right, it's going to be slightly more positive. In polar covalent bonds, the unequal sharing of electrons create partial charges between the atoms. There are positive and negative regions. These are called polar regions. Polar covalent bonds influence interactions with other molecules because of these partially charged regions. Water is a polar molecule, where the polarity is responsible for many of water's unique properties. So again, as an example, we have a water molecule up here, where the oxygen is going to be slightly more negative because that's where the electrons tend to group around, where each of the hydrogens are going to be slightly more positive because they don't have those electrons as much as the oxygen does. So the oxygen end is going to be more negative, the hydrogen ends are going to be more positive. Here's another ChemCat slide for you. Remember, in ionic bonds, electrons are taken, not shared. In covalent bonds, electrons are shared between atoms. However, they may not be shared equally, leading to polar molecules. Last type of chemical bonds that we will look at are called hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bond is the attraction between the negative end of one molecule, the positive hydrogen end of another molecule. They form between water molecules and within larger molecules. Hydrogen bonds are much weaker than covalent bonds, but they are important in structures such as proteins and DNA. As you can see in the picture in this slide, we have two water molecules on the top here. Water molecules by themselves are formed by polar covalent bonds. So remember, this means that water molecules will have a partial negative region and a partial positive region. The oxygen end of water, as we stated earlier, is more negative, where the hydrogen end is going to be slightly more positive. The positive end of one water molecule will be attracted to the negative end of another water molecule. And this is where we get our hydrogen bond. Here in figure 2.4, on the left we have two water molecules that are attracted to each other by hydrogen bonds. Since the hydrogen end is more positive, it is going to be attracted to the negatively charged area of the oxygen end of another water molecule. Hydrogen bonds are also found in large molecules such as proteins and enzymes as well. Hydrogen bonds are very important in the properties of water that are significant for life. Hydrogen makes water a solvent. This is why molecules such as salt and sugar will dissolve within water. Water also has a high heat capacity, which is the number of heat units to raise the temperature 1 degree. Water molecules will form multiple hydrogen bonds with one another. On the left, we have a diagram of water molecules forming hydrogen bonds with one another. Again, just to reinforce that hydrogen bonds form between water molecules. So why are hydrogen bonds important in the properties of water? Well, as we mentioned earlier, we talked about heat capacity. Why is high heat capacity important within water? Well, it takes a lot of energy to raise the temperature of water, which in turn break those hydrogen bonds. Since there are so many hydrogen bonds, it takes a while to do this. This is why large bodies of water remain stable despite air temperature changes. Water is very important in shielding aquatic organisms from fluctuations within environmental temperature. Water has a high heat of vaporization. A lot of energy is required to change water from a liquid to a gaseous state. Evaporation has a cooling effect on the environment. This is a good way to remove excess heat from the body, while sweating cools the body down. Hydrogen bonds also give water the properties of cohesion and adhesion. Cohesion is when molecules resist coming apart due to the hydrogen bonds. Adhesion is between water and a solid surface, due to hydrogen bonding as well. This picture demonstrates nicely adhesion and cohesion. The droplets are forming because water sticks with one another and is adhering to the blade of grass, all due to hydrogen bonding. Cohesion and adhesion allow water to move from roots to leaves and plants via narrow columns of water, as you can see in the picture on the left. This ensures the whole plant can move nutrients and stay hydrated. Water also has a surface tension. This is because the water molecules at the surface are hydrogen bonded to the other molecules below them. This allows certain insects to walk on the surface of water. Polar molecules can interact with other polar molecules due to hydrogen bonds. Molecules may be either hydrophilic or hydrophobic. Hydrophilic molecules, also known as water-loving, will dissolve by water molecules. It's because water will separate these molecules. An example would be salt. So salt is a hydrophilic molecule that dissolves in water, and it's separated into the ions sodium and chloride. Nonpolar molecules are referred to as hydrophobic, or water-hating. Nonpolar molecules do not become separated in aqueous solutions. Oil is an example of a hydrophobic molecule. It will not dissolve in water, and the oil will clump together, as you can see in the bottom right. On the left, we have a hydrophilic molecule being dissolved by water. Notice how the green molecules are being separated from the other green molecules. On the right, we have an example of a hydrophobic molecule. It is still being clumped together in the middle and not being separated by water. Alright, we have our final progress check for this lecture. Please take some time to answer these questions. I find that sometimes students confuse the differences between hydrogen bonds and covalent bonds. So please take some time to review the material for your answers and brush up on anything as needed. So please take some time and do your best to answer these. Alright, one final ChemCat slide. If you have any jokes about covalent bonds, please share. With that, concludes our lecture on Part 1 of Chapter 2. Thank you for listening, and have a good day.